The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Yaron Brook Show. And this Sunday afternoon. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for being here. And we're going to talk about a few things. Today. We're going to start with the Berlin. We're going to talk about the Berlin Wall. We're going to talk about a video somebody sent me about Jordan Peterson talking about creativity. The video is actually called "The Curse of Creativity," which I think reflects some differences between Jordan Peterson and my own ideas. So I think it's a good illustration of some of that. The way Peterson, although again, I think as usual with Jordan Peterson, I think there's a lot interesting in the video as well. So we'll go over that. It's about 6-minute video. We will go over it. All right. Before we get to that. I wanted to talk just for a second about this interview I did with David Pakman. You can find it on on my channel, or on David Pakman's channel, from a few days ago, from last week. And it's a first video of 4. There are going to be 3 more videos coming out. I guess once a week. I'm basically waiting for him to release them. It's 4 interviews that he did with me on objectivism, on different aspects of objectivism. And I think they're worthwhile interviews. I think you should watch them, and I encourage you to do so. And so I want to say just something about that interview. In the interview, he asked me, the first question he asks me is a question about, a quote from Ayn Rand, where he says something like, Ayn Rand says somewhere that existence is identity, and isn't like Deepak Chopra like. And I screwed up. I said, Ayn Rand never said that, when obviously she did. She said it's in Atlas Shrugged, and Leonard Peikoff talks about it in OPA, and it's obviously a truth in objectivism that existence is identity. That is, the relationship between identity and existence is crucial to understanding the metaphysics, and crucial to understanding her view of the metaphysics. To exist is to be something, which is to have an identity. And to have an identity is to exist. So obviously made a mistake. I do that sometimes. I probably do it every single show. This was a big one because it was a direct quote from Ayn Rand, which I did not recognize. And so I screwed up. So for those of you who are devastated by the fact that I made a mistake, get over it. So let me say, I want to say a couple of things about this. One, I don't think much about metaphysics. I don't think about the axioms of metaphysics. I haven't thought about the metaphysics since I read OPA years ago. It's been a while since I read it, and even then, the last time I read it, I probably went over the metaphysics pretty quickly. I don't spend much time contemplating those ideas. So if you throw a quote at me from Ayn Rand, particularly if you link it up to Deepak Chopra, man, I might get it wrong, which I did. And so it's not something I specialize in. If I'd known the first question would be metaphysics, I might have brushed up, or I might have just said, "Hey, talk to a philosopher, don't talk to me." I think the rest of my answer is pretty good, in spite of the fact that I misidentify the quote and I don't explain that complete relationship. The second one is, so that's just me. I screwed up. I should have known better. Fine. Actually 3 things. Second thing is, interviews are hard. They're difficult because you don't know what you're going to be asked. So, and particularly at the beginning of an interview, before you're into the stream of things, it's pretty amazing, the kind of questions they come at you. And I did not expect that question. I didn't have any clue that a question like that would come about. I expected him to ask a much more broader question about Ayn Rand. And they're hard. Interviews are hard. And I'm pretty good at them when the topic is a topic that I am well-versed in and I can respond like this to, because that's what an interview requires. It requires you to immediately respond to something. And I didn't in this case. So, it's not one of those topics. And your mind is not completely there, particularly at the beginning. I used to do a lot with, on Fox News. And some of the shows you would go on and do an interview, and you would know that the first question they ask has nothing to do with the topic they told you were going to ask about. And the reason for that is, they want to throw you off. And it's really hard to be prepared for something like that. Third is, if you want, it is amazing to me. It truly is amazing to me. The number of people that have made such a big deal out of this. So it's one thing if Leonard Peikoff had called me up, and if he'd watched that, he would have called me up and said, "Yaron, you screwed up. What are you doing? You shouldn't. You should know this stuff. This is ridiculous." Because the other thing about Leonard is anytime he sees something that I do is good, he writes to me, and he's always very good at complimenting. And then when I screw up, it's great to, he'll tell you. And he's right. And from him, it's great to get that kind of feedback. The negative feedback and the positive feedback. The point is that most of the people who wrote negative things about this are people who never say anything positive, who never communicate with me about anything. And suddenly, in the hundreds of interviews I've done, they found something I screwed up in. I'm pretty sure I screw up pretty much in every interview that I do, but this one they caught because it was obvious. And the emails and the notices and the comments they write in public stuff is just truly horrific and ridiculous. So, there's a question there of justice. Justice is mostly about the positive. And if you've never said anything positive to me, then shut up. I'm really not interested in your negative views. And, get a life. Get a life and get context. Somebody writes here, this is why Greg Salameri should be the face of objectivism, not Yaron. Greg would be great as the face of objectivism. That would be fantastic. I'm not the face of objectivism. The only face of objectivism has is Ayn Rand. I'm certainly not the face of objectivism. I do what I do. You don't like it, don't watch it. And I don't do this in the name of objectivism. I do this in the name of me and my understanding of objectivism. And Greg will become the face of objectivism when he makes himself the face of objectivism. He certainly has the ability, but, I do what I do. He does what he does. I can't force Greg to do something different. But, get over the idea that, I'm not the face of objectivism. I just happen to be the objectivist who does the most publicly. And I know my stuff, 99% of it. So, get over yourselves, people. Get over yourselves. Greg would be terrific, no question. But, and he knows the philosophy better than I do. Better than I do. He's a philosopher. I don't need you guys to tell me how much you love me. That's fine. My job, as I see it, is to popularize these ideas. I can't think of anybody who would do a better job at that right now in the world right now. Obviously, Ayn Rand. But in terms of popularizing, getting it to new people, intriguing them. But if anybody thinks that I'm infallible, then you guys are nuts. If anybody thinks I'm a philosopher, you're just wrong. I'm not. I never claimed to be. I'm not. So I'm a popularizer. Lots of people have read Ayn Rand because of me. I don't think anybody else, other than Ayn and Leonard, have done more to get people to read Ayn Rand's books, to get people into objectivism. That's my goal. My goal is not to explain the metaphysics and epistemology of objectivism. And I don't aspire to that. I have no interest in doing that. It's not what I do. All right, guys, that's it for me, my mea culpa. So for those of you offended by the fact that I made a mistake, I'm sorry. All right. Yesterday was the 30th anniversary of the Berlin Wall. I really wanted to say something about this because it's such an important event, such a momentous event, and such a misunderstood, I think, event. And in many ways, looking back over the last 30 years, there's tragedy all over those 30 years. But at the end of the day, it is a momentous, celebratory, positive thing. And one of the things I think that I regret, not that I regret, that I think was unfortunate, is that Ayn Rand didn't see it. Because imagine not only Ayn Rand's, just joy in seeing communism collapse, completely collapse. By 1989, when the wall comes down, communism is finished. To see her prediction come true. To see that world liberated from at least this form of collectivism, this monstrosity. So it's sad that Rand did not have the opportunity to actually experience this and actually see it happen. I think she was the number one voice, anti-communist voice in the 20th century. Nobody understood communism. Nobody understood its roots, its sources, what it represented better than she did, and nobody argued for it, against it, over and over and over again, as vehemently again as she did. And it only happened 7 years after she died. She died in 1982, so she could have lived another 7 years to see it. And of course, it could have happened earlier. And this is part of what is misunderstood about the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, a lot of people think that the fall of the Berlin Wall was a consequence of Ronald Reagan ramping up military spending, or any particular thing that a politician did. But the ultimate cause, the real cause of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is what Ayn Rand identified, is its complete and utter bankruptcy, its complete and utter failure. It internally fell apart. I'd say the one thing Ronald Reagan did really to help bring it about is the moral sanction he gave it. His words, not so much his deeds, but his words, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, standing by the solidarity demonstrators, calling them on the immorality, calling the communists on the immorality of their system. But at the end of the day, the death of communism was self-inflicted. The death of communism was a consequence of the fact that communism has to fail. It is a negation of human nature. It is a negation of everything that is required for human beings to be successful, for human beings to thrive, for human beings to create wealth, for human beings to survive. So the only alternatives here are extinction, that people would just die off, or the death of communism itself. Either people die or communism dies. It cannot sustain itself over the long run. Indeed, according to Rand, and I agree with her, communism probably would have failed much, much earlier if two things would have happened. One, if the West had not granted it material support, starting with World War II and providing it with support against Hitler, And then all the way through détente in the 70s and giving them food and technology. American businessmen going over there to drill for oil and to help them develop their oil fields. If not for the help they got from our governments and from the West, communism would have failed much earlier. So communism was destined to die, and it might have even died in the 40s or 50s, if not for us keeping Stalin afloat. I mean, imagine if Hitler had taken Moscow, had destroyed the Soviet Union, had destroyed Stalin. I think the history of the last post-World War II would have been completely different. I still think Hitler would have been annihilated, would have been destroyed. But there wouldn't have been an Eastern Europe. There wouldn't have been a Soviet Union. There wouldn't have been slavery in Eastern Europe and in Russia for decades and decades and decades. The only reason North Korea still survives is because we fed them. So communism cannot sustain itself. Indeed, totalitarianism cannot sustain itself. Look at Venezuela. Totalitarianism, and to a large extent authoritarianism, cannot survive. They cannot produce the goods. And in this context, there's a new book. I haven't read it yet, but it looks really good, by an intellectual who I like in certain things and I don't in other, Victor Davis Hanson, who is a great military historian. And he's got a book debunking the myth that Nazi Germany was prosperous, successful, had great weapons, developed, innovated. He shows they didn't. Their weapon systems were inferior. Their production was inferior. In every aspect, Nazi Germany was inferior to the UK and to the United States. Now, I don't know if he says why, but I can tell you why. The mind doesn't function under force. As a consequence, totalitarianism will always lead to poverty. Totalitarianism will always lead to products that are worthless. Totalitarianism will always lead to defeat. It's just a question of time. And if you let it happen. So, this is why, I see there's, I'll take these couple of questions in a minute. This is why I'm not worried about China as a threat to the United States as China becomes more totalitarian. The more totalitarian China becomes, the poorer it will become. The poorer its weapon systems and inefficient its weapon systems will become. The less motivated its soldiers will be. Technologically, they will deteriorate, and they will be a non-threat to the United States if the United States continues to be free. We're assuming that. You have nothing to fear from totalitarian regimes unless they're suicidal. Now, you have to fear the violence, but you don't have to fear defeat if you are free. It's not an accident. The United States could turn on a dime and turn itself into a weapons-producing juggernaut in World War II and crush the Germans. Indeed, as I've said before, Victor Davis Hanson is the one who pointed out that if Patton had been listened to among the generals, World War II would have ended 6 months, 9 months earlier. Now, somebody in the chat says German tanks were far superior to Western tanks. They were not. Read Victor Davis Hanson. Again, the book is exactly on that. On were the German tanks really superior to British tanks or American tanks? Were the German aircraft superior? No. It turns out that even as British planes were being shot down, manufacture of planes in England was far superior to the manufacturing of planes in Germany in terms of quantity and quality. And it turns out the Western tanks were indeed better than German tanks. But again, I'm not an expert on this. I refer you to the book. It's the latest book. I don't remember the name, by Victor Davis Hanson. So communism and fascism, to the extent that they're authoritarian, and they have to be, are self-defeating. Self-defeating. So I don't worry about totalitarians as enemies of the United States. I worry about the United States' willingness to defend itself. That's what I think is a problem. All right, let's take two questions and then a few more things about the Berlin Wall. I'm from Germany here. Is the rise of socialism, environmentalism, tribalism, nationalism, far left, right parties, anti-Semitism, and so on, where there is that rise? Ominous parallels are complete back more than in the US. I'm angry and depressed. Your thoughts? I agree with you. Germany is a mess. And Germany is a mess because the lessons of the fall of the Berlin Wall were not learnt. People thought that the Berlin Wall fell and that what had won, communism had failed, and what had won was the mixed economy. People thought that the Berlin Wall fell, and as a famous historian and social thinker, Huntington mentions, Huntington? Was it? No, it wasn't. Fukuyama, not Huntington. Fukuyama mentioned, it was the end of history. Because we had discovered the truth. What works is liberal democracy, mixed economy. And mixed economy had beaten communism. But this is the big mistake. And the big mistake is that it's not about politics. And it's not that liberal democracy defeated the Soviet Union. It's that the Soviet Union died. And instead of learning from that death, learning that collectivism, mysticism or anti-reason, altruism are the death of any country, ultimately. Instead of learning from that, the intellectuals in the West just settled, oh, communism's gone, okay. Well, that didn't work. But we still have altruism, and we still have collectivism, and we still, are skeptical about reason, particularly as applied to anything that's not science. So, Henry mentions on the chat, Ronald Reagan actually attributed the victory to faith, to non-reason. So the lessons of the Berlin Wall coming down were never learnt. Indeed, the opposite was adopted. The opposite was adopted. We embraced collectivism. We embraced statism. We embraced altruism. Just as much after the fall of communism as we did before. So we learned nothing from the fall of communism. We have no conception of what caused communism to be successful and to fail. And what are the philosophical roots of communism? And those philosophical roots were never rejected. Never rejected. And here, a big blame goes to the people who defend free markets, but are afraid of talking about the philosophical roots. Right? Because it's the spokesman for capitalism, the spokesman for free markets, who betrayed capitalism and free markets by refusing to identify, and I say refusing to identify because I think it involved evasion, the philosophical roots of capitalism and freedom. And those philosophical roots are the enlightenment, are the ideas of the efficacy of reason and the sanctity of the individual. It's the idea of moral individualism, of the pursuit of happiness, the negation of collectivism, and the negation of unreason, the negation of faith. And it's because our intellectuals didn't do that you in Germany, as everywhere else, are reliving all of this. We're reliving the rise of socialism in the form of environmentalism and different forms of tribalism. We're reliving the rise of fascism with the new right-wing parties in Germany and elsewhere around Europe, and the rise of white supremacists in the United States. We're reliving all that because we never questioned the underlying causes. We never challenged them. And we never presented an alternative. So the failure is the failure of the intellectuals. The failure is the failure of our thinkers. The failure is the failure of our leaders who misidentified what happened, who can't think in terms of philosophy, who can't think in terms of ideas. It had to be dollars. It had to be economic. No. The Soviet Union fell because it was anti-life, anti-human being, anti-the individual, and some people in that world had enough self-respect, had enough knowledge of what's required for them to live as to revolt against it. And it didn't happen as much in Russia itself as it did in the periphery. In Czech Republic, in East Germany, where people went out to the streets, in Poland, and demanded their liberty, demanded their freedom. That's why it fell. It fell because there was that remnant of what's possible. And I think the more exposure people got to the West, the more they saw how richer the West was, the more they wanted that. But again, even the people in the East did not have a clear alternative, did not have a clear vision of what freedom looks like, and we did not help them because we did not supply a vision like that, those of us in the West. So again, the intellectuals failed the people in Eastern Europe. So they got mixed economies. Some of them a little better, some of them a lot worse, but mixed economies. And now, when the mixed economies are failing, people are going, what happened? This was supposed to be the end of history. This was supposed to have solved all our problems. So now that they see that the problems are not solved, they're looking for solutions. And the only solutions available to them are the ancient solutions. The return to tribalism, the return to socialism, the return to fascism. That's all they know. That's all that exists. Because when we had the opportunity, when the West had the opportunity to assert itself, to declare victory, and to teach us about the causes of that victory, the West failed. They failed those of us living in the West, and they failed all those who are now free for the first time in decades living in the East. The revolution needs to happen as a philosophic revolution. It's not political. It's not about this or that idea. It's about philosophical ideas, deep ideas, important ideas. In morality, in epistemology, in political theory. And until we have those ideas, until we argue those ideas, until we articulate those ideas, until we are morally confident in those ideas, then we will keep reverting back. We'll keep cycling, keep committing the same horrors that we swore would never be committed again. And that's what we're living through today. And you're seeing it in Germany. You're seeing the rise of these tribalistic, collectivistic, altruistic ideologies in Germany because it never went away. In a sense, particularly in Germany, Immanuel Kant never went away. He's still alive and well. And he still is the dominant philosopher of the West. And as long as he is, we will get communism. We will get fascism. We will get other forms of collectivism, statism, tribalism, resurgent. And unfortunately, the United States of America is not immune to any of that. All right, somebody's asking, how do you respond to someone who says that Hong Kong protests on American conspiracy designed to make Chinese government look tyrannical. This is the view of many Chinese who's being propagandized here. Well, I mean, I've been to China, and I've been to Hong Kong, and there's just no basis for those ideas. I mean, there's a sense in which I wish it was an American conspiracy. I wish America had it in them to have such a conspiracy, to encourage people to stand up for their rights, to stand up for their liberty. And what are the Hong Kong demonstrations about? They're about an extradition law that was clearly bad, clearly a way for the Chinese government to implement Chinese law in Hong Kong without taking it over officially. Keeping the two systems, one nation idea, but basically applying Chinese law because they could ask for extradition and try people in China. And when I was in Hong Kong, not young people, a lot of people were worried about this, were afraid of this. And that's what initiated, right? Initiated the whole demonstrations. Then what are the rest of the demands of the demonstrators? Well, that somebody look into how the police have behaved. Somebody look into police brutality. And then third, basically, it's a question of democracy. They want to elect their own representative. Now, all of those are legitimate demands. All of those are demands that China does not accept. And people are demonstrating. You don't need an American conspiracy to get any of that. Now, are some of these students supported by some institutions that might be based in America? I don't know. Maybe. But they're also supported by some, very few unfortunately, Chinese business people. But what are they arguing for? And none of this is, of course, exists in China. You can't do these kind of demonstrations in China. Right? All right. So no, I don't think America is propagandizing this. I don't think America is capable of propagandizing this, because what would they be propagandizing? What virtue? And what is it that the demonstrators are demanding that is wrong? That's the real question. All right. So, let's see. So my point about the Berlin Wall is this is a time to celebrate. It's pretty amazing that the Berlin Wall came down. It's as bad as things are today in the West or all over the world. They're far, far better than they were in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, when the wall was still up. World is in better shape. We have more opportunities to change the world and to make it better. We have more opportunities to improve the world out there than we've ever had. So it's not a time to be depressed. At the same time, we have to realize that unless we start advocating for the right ideas, unless we reject the ideas that made communism possible, we're going to end up there in the end. And I mean, it's a good illustration of our weakness, failure, demise is right now on my chat the number of crazy, insane, evil, racist trolls. But, that's where we are. We've got the alt-right racism in America. We've got the alt-right racism in Germany. And we've got communism, socialism on the rise in both America and Germany. And that's always the pattern. That is, fascism and communism, fascism and socialism go hand in hand. Each one feeds off of each other as supposedly the response to one another. But they're both equally destructive. They're both equally evil. They're both equally the same. And they bring about the same kind of destruction, the same kind of hell as the other. And unfortunately, the world is going back there unless we reject these ideas and embrace the positive. And the positive is reason, egoism, individual rights, and capitalism. All right, my spiel on the Berlin Wall. Let's do Jordan Peterson next. So somebody sent me this clip of Jordan, and it's good. It's Jordan at his kind of best. You know, he's incredibly charismatic and articulate and interesting. But you can also see all the things that I think. And by the way, I know there's I did want to say this before we get away from the Berlin Wall. We talked about war and stuff. There's a new movie out on the Battle of Midway. I haven't seen it, and I don't know if it's any good. But Midway was an incredibly important battle in World War II, and an example of American ingenuity and American success, and what makes America America, or what made America America, and why America was destined not by destiny, but destined by its freedom to win World War II. And I have a talk on the Battle of Midway. You can find it online. Just put Battle of Midway, Yaron Brook, and you can hear it. And I think it's a good talk. It's a dramatization. It's a explanation of what happened, why the Battle of Midway is so important, and why it's an illustration of the value of freedom and of independent thinkers and of the mind. The Battle of Midway was a product of the mind. The victory was the product of the mind. So I encourage you to listen to it. You can't. There's no video of it, but there is audio of it. I gave it on an aircraft carrier. That's the other thing. It was on an aircraft carrier as part of a 4th of July celebration. I gave that talk. All right, so Jordan Peterson, we're going to look at his video. The video is called The Curse of Creativity. I don't think he named it that way, but you'll see there's some legitimacy to this. And I think it's interesting. I think you can see Jordan Peterson's sense of life come across here. I think you could see his perspective on human success and human happiness come through here. I've got a second video of Jordan as well, where he's talking to somebody about art, which I think is also interesting. If we have time, I'll play you that as well, to show some of the problems, which I think Jordan's approach and what it involves. All right, so I am going to turn this down. So the issue is creativity. And before we start, I just want to tell you what I think creativity is. Creativity is one's ability to, in a sense, reshape the world in front of us. It's one's ability to either do it through art, by a selective recreation of the world out there, based on our own values. It could be in any activity one engages in, where one does things differently, better. So in each activity, better would depend on what the activity happened to be. And in what is called outside the box, in an unconventional, in a different way. So creativity is what is required in order to, do things better, differently, in the world out there, to improve our lot in one way or another. To create is to rearrange the combination of natural elements. That's Ayn Rand's definition. To create is to rearrange the stuff of existence, the stuff that's out there. In art, it's to rearrange it based on your values. In business, it's to rearrange the factors of productions in ways that produce something new, something different, or something more productive. Now, let's take a look at what Jordan has to say about creativity. Oh, let me switch videos. All right, there we go. Play.
So I say, well, everyone's not creative, and everybody goes, oh, that's terrible.
No, it's true. Not everybody's creative. I mean, one of the things that I think Jordan is his great appeal results from is the fact that he doesn't BS you. You get a sense that he's telling you what he really thinks. He's not playing games. He's not trying to be PC in any way. He's saying what he thinks, even when what he thinks is controversial, is upsetting, is emotionally unpleasing. Well, of course, not everybody's creative. Now, Jordan and I will probably disagree on why not everybody's creative, on where creativity, in a sense, comes from. But it's absolutely true that most people today are not creative. Whether they could be is a good question. I think many more people could be creative than are. But most people are not creative.
It's like, it's not so terrible. It's not self-evident that you would curse someone with high levels of creativity.
Now notice, so for him, having high levels of creativity, now we're talking about high levels of creativity, really exceptional creativity, not just creative, but really the genius creators. He views that as a curse. Now that's Jordan's sense of life. That's Jordan's view of life as a struggle, as difficult, as painful. And it's sad because he has an appreciation for the creative, and yet he views it in such negative terms ultimately. And much of what he says about the difficulty of creative people is true. But even with all the difficulties of being creative, is it really bad to be creative? I mean, unpleasant for you? I doubt it. See, but his standard is not happiness. His standard is just satisfaction.
You know, you hear very frequently people say things like everyone's creative. It's like, that's wrong, okay? It's wrong. It's just as wrong as saying that everyone's extroverted.
That's true. Not everybody's creative.
First of all, you have to be pretty damn smart to be creative, because otherwise you're just going to get to where other people have thought, and that's not creative by definition.
I'm not sure that's true. So I don't think that's true. Creativity is not measured based on other people. Creativity is in your sphere, in your world. Can you change things? Can you rearrange things in ways that make that world better? If you're cleaning floors, I know nobody today cleans floors, but if you're cleaning floors, and you find a different way to do it that's more productive, that's easier, that's better for you, that gets it done faster. Somebody else might have invented this technique 100 years ago. People might be using this technique all over the world. But for you, it's new. You created it. You did something more efficiently, differently. Now, this is not a genius creative, but it's a little act of creativity. So I think he equivocates between just the act of creativity and the genius creative. For him, creativity is a 0-1. You're either creative or you're not. And the fact is that it's not 0-1. Right? The fact is that not everybody is creative. I suspect that everybody is capable of being created. Is capable of being created. It requires a certain mental state. It requires a certain type, a way of thinking. But I think everybody is capable of it at their own level. At whatever capabilities they have. At whatever IQ, Jordan Peterson loves IQ, whatever IQ they happen to have. So I don't think it's a 0-1 as he presented. And it's a 0-1 for a reason you'll see in a minute.
So being fast and being out there at the front of things really makes a difference. And then you also have to have these divergent thinking capabilities, and that's part of your trait structure.
So that's part of your trait structure. Now this is really important in Jordan Peterson's world, because this, basically what he's saying is, you're born with it. You're either born with the ability to be creative or not. It's a trait that you inherit. It's not a method of dealing with reality. It's not an ability to apply reason in a particular way, to apply your mind in a particular way. It is inherent. Some people are creative and some people are not. Some people have the creativity gene and some people do not. And he talks about this. I've seen other interviews where he talks about this as well. He really does think this is inherited. And that's it. Now, he also thinks that in many people who have the creativity gene, it is suppressed, and he's right about the suppression of creativity. We have an educational system which is built around suppressing creativity. It's built around, the whole educational system as it exists today is built around training factory workers to follow orders. It's a German educational system created by Bismarck in the 19th century. And the purpose was to train workers to follow orders. It is not geared so you can suppress people's creativity. And we do that regularly all the time in our schools, in our institutions, in our homes. Parents do that all the time. And he recognizes that you can suppress it. But he doesn't believe you can bring it out of somebody because you're born with it or not. But this is the whole problem I have with evolutionary psychologists. Is they don't really understand. First of all, you can't prove that. There's no proof of that. And you can't separate out the habits, the thinking habits, the way in which we think, the conclusions we form, the decisions we make when we're very little, when we're young, and how that shapes our adult life to genes shaping our adult life. But it is a massive, if you think that all this, I'll put it this way, it's this idea that you can take something as complex as creativity, something as complex as how you use your mind, and that is somehow genetically coded in our genes. I think it's just ludicrous. I think our genes, there's a big element of intelligence that is coded in our genes. Although I think there's huge environmental factors, and the most important factor, even with regard to intelligence, is choices we make as young people. I think the same thing is true, in creativity, is not raw horsepower. Creativity is an approach. It's a way to deal. It's really, creativity is the activation of one's mind. It's thinking things through. It's not accepting things as they are. And this is all a product of motivation and ideas. It's a function of will. Now, there are levels of creativity, just like there are levels of intelligence. There are certain areas where I cannot be creative. Aesthetics, for example, art, which is a big area of creativity. I'm not creative. I have no creativity when it comes to art. I have no ability and no creativity. I think in terms of articulating ideas, in terms of delivering those ideas, particularly verbally, I think I'm creative, original, creative, do it differently. Somebody says, Chris is talking about daydreaming. Yeah, daydreaming might not, he says daydreaming is not creativity either, although Jordan Peterson talks about daydreaming. But daydreaming might be, if it's, depending on what it is, might be, imagination, using one's imagination. And that might lead to creativity, right? If that imagination is productive, if that imagination is reorganizing reality in a way that actually moves something forward, actually produces something. But yeah, Chris says creativity requires work, skill, knowledge, absolutely. Devoid of work, skill, and knowledge, what you get in creativity is modern art, which I think Jordan Peterson is a fan of, because he can't separate the two out. To him, if it's different, it's creative. No. It has to, in the realm in which it is produced, it has to move things forward. It has to be different, but it has to be something. Like art has to follow a certain prescription. Art is something. So a urinal framed in a museum, I mean, most art critics today would consider that incredibly creative. Nobody else thought of it. But it's not art. So it's not creative. It's just silly. It's just silly because it doesn't actually manifest itself in anything meaningful. There has to be a meaning to it. And the meaning has to be reflected in the thing. You know, art has to have meaning. Or there are lots of things that in business people say, oh, let's do it this way. And it's completely original. It's completely different than anything else anybody else has done. But it's useless because it doesn't enhance productivity. It doesn't create something new or value. But yeah, in a sense it was creative. But it wasn't. Creativity is not just coming up with something new. Creativity is coming up with something new in the context of its use. It has to fulfill its purpose. And art is not in the eye of the beholder. I mean, there are elements of art that are in the eye of the beholder. But whether something is art or not is not in the eye of the beholder. Whether something is art or not is objective. And art needs to be objectively defined. And Ayn Rand does objectively define art. And then the question is, does this piece of work qualify under this definition? And is it creative? Or is it just mimicking every other people? Or is it just boring? Or is it just uninteresting? Or is it just a copy? So it has to be new and useful in a sense. That's what creativity requires. It's not just the newness. And this is why modern art, there's such confusion about it, because it's new. Nobody's ever splattered paint on a canvas exactly like this. Of course, if you try splattering paint today on a canvas, they'll say, oh, you're just trying to be like, you know, Kandinsky or whoever. No, it wasn't Kandinsky. Whoever the guy who splashed Pollock, or Pollock, I think, is a paint splasher. So definitions are important. And understanding what creativity is and in what context it is crucial. All right.
Creative people are really different than non-creative people.
That's true.
Partly because, for example, they're highly motivated to do creative things and to experience novelty and to chase down aesthetic experiences and to attend movies and to read fiction and to go to museums and to enjoy poetry and to enjoy music that's not conventional music, for example.
Well, I don't know what conventional music is. I mean, maybe it's noise. But yes, creative people are highly motivated. Creative people are curious. Creative people, and I'd say healthy creative people, explore the arts, are interested in aesthetic experiences. Creative people are hardworking, motivated, and engaged in the world around them. The world around them is important. And they're curious. And I don't know that you can teach curiosity. I don't know where it comes from. It's not a gene, but it's something about how we relate to the world when we're growing up, whether we develop that curiosity or not. Somebody writes, if you engaged creatively in the arts, I suspect you might feel differently. As someone who has a strong aptitude for music, I can tell you it's not fully cerebral. It's that, but more. Yes, of course, I'm not saying, I don't know what fully cerebral is. Art is not fully something you can conceptualize into words. It's not fully logical in that sense. It's not deductive. It's not something you deduce. And your emotions and your sense of life, as Ayn Rand describes it, are hugely have to be integrated into any artistic creation. You have to have the skill, you have to have the knowledge of how music works, what it is, how instruments sound, how the harmonies work, don't work. You have to have all the skill involved, but then you have to have more than that. And indeed, very few people are creative at the genius level in music. And the problem with music today is that it's devoid of skill. That is, today, too much of music is just the emotion, just what you feel like. And that skill in developing harmonies and melodies and actually the cerebral part is missing because all you want is creativity. And that's true in so many of the plastic arts, splashing paint on a canvas and so on. That's not art. It has to be the combination of the cerebral and your sense of life. And the cerebral is that attempt that you're making to recreate something in the world out there. And music is trickier because it's not obviously clear what it is we're trying to recreate when we do music. But some music is music, and some things that sell as music are actual just noise. And some stuff that is sold as music is just boring and dull and uninteresting. That's most pop music today. And repetitive and non-creative, and because it's just repetitive. So, but there are all kinds of levels of creativity. Again, not everybody's a genius. And it's not. Now, your musical aptitude might be something you're born with. I mean, Mozart could hear something and perfectly transcribe it at a very, very young age. And that is probably ability to some extent that you're born with. You have to have more than just be born with it. You have to want it. You have to like it. You have to be motivated around it. But there's certain aptitudes that we are born with. But the aptitude does not create the creativity. You have to be able to use the creativity. For that, you need to be motivated. You have to have goals. You have to be willing to work hard. All right, let's listen to George.
Trivial differences. And so it's a real misstatement to make the proposition that everyone's creative. It's just simply not the case. It's a matter of wishful thinking.
That's true, but the question is, can everybody be creative? Or can a vast number of people that are more creative than they are today be creative? Is it an issue of choices, of education, of emphasis, of motivation, or is it something you're born with? I certainly don't think it's something you're born with.
It's like saying that everyone's intelligent. Well, if everyone's intelligent, then the term loses all of its meaning, because any term that you can apply to every member of a category has absolutely no meaning.
Well, that's not true. Everybody is human, and the human still has meaning. So, that's kind of silly. Everybody's intelligent is assuming that that intelligence, when he means intelligence, is above the mean, is more intelligent. So it's true that everybody cannot be above average. And that's what he's really getting at. But it's not that you can't use the term to describe everybody. So that's just slop.
And the other thing you want to be thinking about here is that don't be thinking that creativity is such a good thing.
Yeah, this is his malevolence, and this is his attitude towards life coming through. This is really interesting.
It's a high-risk, high-return strategy.
It's high-risk, high-return strategy in what sense? In a financial sense, yeah, only a few artists. And if you think about creativity as art, only a few artists make it. But is the trying not its own reward? Is the trying and not hitting the home run, but only hitting singles, not a reward in and of itself? Is it only the winners, only the billionaires who are rewarded through entrepreneurship? Isn't entrepreneurship Isn't entrepreneurship just a reward in and of itself? And aren't lots of entrepreneurs rewarded and happy in spite of the fact that only very few become billionaires?
So if you're creative, you just try this. There's creative people in this room, man. You guys are going to have a hell of a time monetizing your creativity. It's virtually impossible. It's really, really difficult because, first of all, let's say you make an original product. You think the world will beat a pathway to your door if you build a better mousetrap. It's like, that's complete rubbish.
Well, absolutely. That's wrong. And this goes to the point of hard work. Creativity requires a lot of work, and creativity requires, to be successfully at creativity, requires you to think, and requires you to think outside, not just your little box. The whole point of creativity is to shatter the box and to understand other features. And good entrepreneurs, for example, who are creative, understand that there's a role for marketing and a role for other things, and also understand that sometimes you fail. And sometimes you have to pivot. Sometimes you have to change. And you have to be open to that. An open mind, a creative mind, is open to change.
Isn't true in the least. If you make a good creative product, you've probably solved about 5% of your problem.
Exaggeration. If it really is a good problem, then you've solved a lot more than 5%. Most companies that fail don't fail because of the marketing. They fail because of the product. Some companies fail because of the marketing. But if the product sucks, good marketing is not going to help you. So the product is a huge percentage of your success. And then you need good marketing, good sales, good everything else, good production. But that'll come because the venture capitalists will see it. Other people in the marketplace will see it. That'll come if you have a good product. So a product is much more than 5%.
Then you have marketing, which is insanely difficult, and then you have sales, and then you have customer support, and then you have to build an organization. And if it's really novel, you have to tell people what the hell the thing is. No one knows what that is, and that's a real problem. If you write a book, well, then you have the problem that another million people have also written a book. But if you produce something that's completely new and doesn't have a category, people can't search for it online. How are they going to find it?
But the amazing thing is that all innovation, all progress is people devising something that has no category. And they manage to get the word out there. Even the ones that don't have great marketing, they manage to get the word out there. Because we're eager to adopt things that are really great products. Now, some are geniuses at the marketing as well, as Steve Jobs was. But was he great at marketing from day one? Well, maybe by the time Macintosh came around, he was. If you remember that 1984 ad for the Macintosh, it was pretty cool. So Steve Jobs combined the genius of product with the genius of marketing. He was creative in multiple realms. And it's rare. So Jordan is absolutely right in terms of articulating the difficulties here of entrepreneurs.
Pricing problems, and it's
Pricing
really unbelievably difficult to produce something creative and then monetize it. And even worse, if you're the creative person, let's say you have a spectacular invention, you've got no money, right? You've got no customers. Those are big problems. And so maybe you go and you find a venture capitalist. We start with family and friends because that's how it works. You raise money for your product. You raise money from your family and friends. That's assuming you have family and friends that have some money and that they're going to give it to you. And most people aren't in that situation. So it's a terrible barrier right off the bat. And then, of course, you're putting your family and friends at substantial financial risk because
God, who's going to want to be an entrepreneur after hearing this?
the probability that your stupid idea is going to make money is virtually zero, even if it's a really brilliant idea. And so then let's say, well, you get past...
By the way, that's just not true. I mean, yes, most startups fail. But it's also true that you learn a huge amount by doing the startup. You improve your skills a huge amount by doing it. You learn from the failure, and the second time, you're more likely to succeed. Or you might take those skills and go work for another entrepreneur and not start the company from scratch. But I don't know very many people who have gone the route of entrepreneurship in a place like Silicon Valley, who have worked for startups, who have done startups, who regret that fact, even if they failed. The journey is not only a good in and of itself, but the journey, you learn so much from the journey that it improves your skills for everything else. So for Jordan, it's as if The only thing, I mean, he doesn't believe in happiness in a sense that you work towards happiness. But it's as if unless you're 100% successful, there's no value here. But that's complete nonsense. There's massive value. Even in failure. If you're conscious of that failure, you understand it, you learn from it, and you're constantly learning, which is what's required to be a creative person. Constantly thinking, constantly observing, constantly looking, constantly motivated to do things better, to improve oneself. Then the journey is fantastic. The journey is good. It's not just the end result that has to be perfect.
Family and friends, and you get venture capitalists involved, because that's often the next step. There's steps in building a business. Family and friends, angel investor, that's some rich guy that you've happened to meet, some man or some way, who's into this sort of thing and is willing to provide you with some money to get your product off the ground. Well, how much of your product is that person going to take? Well, most of it.
Oh my God, I mean, not necessarily. And yeah, I mean, again, this is so depressing. Why would anybody want to be an entrepreneur?
Most of it. And no wonder, because, you don't have any money. How are you going to bargain for control over your product? He'll just say, well, do you want the money or not? And if your answer is no, then he'll go and do something else with his money. It's not like there's no shortage of things that you can do with your money.
But there is. The world has a massive shortage of great ideas. There's plenty of capital. What's missing are great ideas. And if you have a great idea, you can raise capital for it. It's not easy. Now we'll get to art. Art is different. Art is harder. Art, particularly in the culture we live in today, is particularly hard. We'll get to that in a minute. But entrepreneurship? No. The shortage here is ideas. There's plenty of capital. Plenty of money out there.
There's a million things you can do with it. So you're not in a great bargaining position. And then if you get venture capitalists involved, they'll take another big chunk, and maybe if they're not very straight with you, they'll just throw you out. Because maybe by that point in the company's development, you're nothing but a pain in the neck.
Because that's how venture capitalists succeed, by not being honest with you and just throwing you out. Now, some founders are thrown out. Sometimes because they deserve to be thrown out. Some founders are demoted because they're not good at doing everything. But if they stick with it, if they're not stupid about it, then even founders that are demoted make a gazillion of dollars and do very, very well for themselves because they recognize that maybe somebody else is better at being a CEO. There's no advantage of being a CEO if you're no good at it.
What do you know about marketing and sales and customer service
marketing or sales,
and building an organization and running a business? Like, you don't have a clue, so why do they need you? So even if you're successful at generating a new idea and you put it into a business, the probability that you, as the originator of the idea, are going to make some money from it is very, very low. So don't be thinking that creativity is something you would want to curse yourself with. Now,
come on, Jordan. Curse yourself with? Being creative is, to a large extent, what makes life fun. Rearranging things in your world, making your world yours. Doing things differently, being different, being new. That's part of what makes life fun. Now, true, not everybody can do it. Not everybody can be happy. Not everybody. Because, we've crushed, we've in so many dimensions, we crush people's ability to be creative. But really? The curse of creativity?
it's not all bad because it opens up avenues of experience for creative people that aren't available to people who aren't creative.
Yeah.
But it definitely is a high-risk, high-return strategy.
It's a high-risk strategy, but everything in life is high-risk. Everything worthwhile in life is high-risk. Survival is high-risk. Living is high-risk. Happiness is high-risk. Yes, life is risk, but that's not a bad thing. There's always, as Jordan tells us, death around the corner. That's why you should live. That's why you should try to be creative. That's why you should explore. That's why you should do things differently. That's why you shouldn't put yourself in a box because, it's risky to be creative. I mean, one of the people discouraging creativity right now, unfortunately, in this talk, is Jordan.
So the overwhelming probability is that you will fail. But a small proportion of creative people succeed spectacularly.
That is not true. That is just not true that most creative people fail. Now, it is true in the arts. It's true in the arts today. Because there is no conception of art today. So when people have no definition of art, when people have no respect for art, when people have no respect for talent in the art, for work in the art, when people don't know what art is, because art is super intellectual, art relies completely on our intellectual framework. And the success of an artist depends so much on the critic. And the critics today are so corrupt, they're unthinking morons. I mean, maybe with the exception of movies, maybe. And people don't consider movies high art, right? They're ignorant that, yes, one of the great tragedies of the world in which we live, is the fact that we don't encourage creativity in art. Because we have no idea what art is. So we can't encourage creativity in art. So to be an artist today, a good artist, an artist that actually is recreating reality, is a losing proposition because the gallery owners, the museums, the collectors, and the critics are all second-handed morons who don't buy great art, but buy creativity for the sake of creativity, different for the sake of being different. Right? So, yes, being an artist is the most difficult thing to be in the world in which you are today. Because you're dependent on a marketplace that doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist because we've driven the collectors, we've driven the people who value art. They have no idea what to look for because they rely on the intellectuals. They rely on the critics to help them. They rely on education. They rely on teachers. They rely on our professors. They rely on knowledge. And the knowledge doesn't exist. So the collectors don't exist. And if the collectors don't exist, the people buying art don't exist. And people are afraid of art because art is very revealing. And as a consequence of their fear of art and their lack of self-esteem when it comes to art, again, they rely on critics, they rely on authorities, and the authorities are all wrong about art. And in a world where the authorities are all wrong about art, yeah, being an artist is very, very, very difficult. Very difficult. It's the most challenging profession in the world today, I think. All right.
So it's like a lottery in some sense.
It's not a lottery. Lottery's luck. Lottery's luck. It's not a lottery.
But if you don't lose, you could win big. And that keeps a lot of creative people going. But also, they don't really have much choice in it.
Yeah, it's not what keeps creative people going. It's not winning the lottery. I don't know any creative person in the arts, for example, or as an entrepreneur who is going just because they might hit a home run. They might be a billionaire. They might get a museum to take their work. If that was the motivation, there'd be no artists. There'd be no entrepreneurs. Because he's right. Billionaires are 1 in a billion. Well, maybe not. 1 in several tens of millions.
If you're a creative person, you're like a fruit tree that's bearing fruit. You can suppress it, but it's very bad for you.
That is all true. That is all true. If I think, yes, you cannot, suppressing your creativity is really harmful.
The creative people I've worked with is if they're not creative, they're miserable, so they have to do it. You know, there's real joy and pleasure in it and psychological utility, but it's certainly not a conservative strategy for moving forward through life. And, you know, whenever
You shouldn't be a conservative.
People who are creative, and you guys should listen to this, because I know what I'm talking about. If you happen to be creative, if you're a songwriter or another kind of musician or an artist or any of the other number of things that you might be, find a way to make money and then practice your
That is
craft
true.
on the side.
That is
because
true.
you'll starve to death otherwise. Now, for some of you, that won't be true, but it's a tiny minority. Your best bet is to find a job that will keep body and soul together and parse off some time that you can pursue your creative
For most
thing. Because
artists, that
then,
is
well,
true.
as a long-term strategy, a medium to long-term strategy, it's a better one. But it's got incredibly difficult for people, musicians, for example, it's incredibly difficult for new musicians to monetize their craft, even if they're really, really good at it.
All right. That is Jordan Peterson and creativity. I think that malevolence comes through. I think his definitions are not clear. They're wrong. There's a determinism that's there. You can see all the problems with Jordan Peterson manifest. And a lot of what he says is true, and a lot of what he says is interesting. But the way it's framed is disappointing. But it is Jordan. I mean, he couldn't frame it otherwise. He wouldn't be himself. He wouldn't be who he is. All right, we've got some super chat questions. I'm not going to take a lot because it's already late. Let's see. Let's see if we've got, I'm going to keep that to last. How to introduce people, no, I'm not going to keep that. Have you read Somerset Maugham's The Moon and the Sixpence, short novel about a lawyer who leaves his entire life behind to become a painter? I'd pay to get your commentary on it, well worth reading. I haven't read it. I'll put it on my list. Hopefully I'll get to it and I'll get back to you. What potential do you see in 3D printing? Printing is an art medium. Does sculpture need to be done with hands rather than a program? Well, I think so. I mean, the program could make copies, but I think the original has to be, it doesn't have to be by hand in the sense that I think it can be manipulated, let's say, on screen in some way. But I don't see how you translate code in and of itself, writing code, into a value statement in a three-dimensional space. I think you can model something three-dimensionally, using software, and I don't think the software is good enough today, but I imagine it will be one day, where you can create the figure and then reproduce it with a 3D printer of some sort. I think that would be fine, but I think it has to be molded. It can't just be, I'm writing code and that's me being an artist. I think the art has to be actually creating in front of you, visually, some representation of reality in sculpture or in painting. And that could be used with in a sense, a digital paintbrush or something like that, but it still has to be, it has to be molded visually by you. And I don't think you could do that with code. I don't think you would get there with code. Let's see. By the way, I love the idea of 3D printing because part of the struggle that sculptors have is they can make a beautiful sculpture in clay, and then getting it reproduced is so hard because now you're dependent on the labor of others, the ingenuity, the creativity of others to be able to do it without damaging it. So 3D printing would be phenomenal. So imagine you sculpt something in clay, and then you scan it, and then you 3D print it in some other material somewhere else. I mean, that would save sculptors huge amount of time, mental effort, physical effort, because a lot of sculptors actually go to the foundries and do the work themselves, and it would be a huge improvement. And you could reduce the cost of sculpture dramatically. But I don't think the 3D printing is good enough yet. And I don't think it's in the right kind of materials yet to get us to the point where it's good enough. But that's the future. The future is to do 3D printing of sculpture and to reproduce painting, to do painting and then reproduce painting digitally. But we need some great painters and great sculptors to move this forward. And that's where the deficit is. As an avid objectivist, musician, and Jordan Peterson fan, I have to say that I think you're completely missing his point by miles, and you're doing so ironically the same way people do with Ayn Rand. I don't think so. I mean, I hear that criticism all the time about Jordan, about my analysis of Jordan Peterson, but I just don't think that's true. I think, and all you have to do is listen to enough Jordan Peterson, you see it. He's got a malevolent sense of life. He does not believe that your action lead to happiness. Happiness is something that just happens to you, and if you have it, you should be happy because it's a fluke. He's got a very negative, dark, malevolent sense of life, and I think his discussion of creativity does that. And I've listened to other talks. I mean, I was gonna play a part of his lecture on exploring the psychology of creativity, and it's the same thing. And when he talks about art, he's completely wrong about art. When he talks about art, he talks about it in the same sense. He has no definition of art. An art is just doing something that nobody else has done, in a sense, but deep meaning. But the meaning could be whatever. It's not about recreating reality. So he has no good definition of art, which throws him completely off. So I respect Jordan, and I think he has some interesting things to say, but he is wrong often. And his malevolent sense of life is not a misinterpretation of it. It's what he says. So I don't think it's anything close to what people do to Ayn Rand, because what they do to Ayn Rand is they completely contradict what she says. They completely misinterpret her, or they accuse her of things she never said. But I just played you. It's right there. I mean, in the end, you be the judge. You be the judge. But, Jordan Peterson is a conservative. He's not an objectivist. He's an evolutionary psychologist who believes that a lot of things are evolutionarily determined, which are not. A lot of things that are not evolutionarily determined, he believes they are. And it distorts everything, unfortunately, distorts much of what he has to offer. He's incredibly smart. He's incredibly interesting. He's incredibly charismatic, but he is unbelievably wrong. He just is. And if you don't see it, I'm trying my best to show you why he's wrong. But the idea that he's an objectivist, the idea that his ideas are completely consistent with Ayn Rand's in any kind of way, is completely bizarre. And he would view it as bizarre. I mean, he's wrong in epistemology. He's wrong in metaphysics. He's wrong in ethics. He denies the self. Now, if you agree with him, that's fine, but then you're disagreeing with objectivism. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And he would be the first to admit that. He doesn't pretend. That's why I respect him. He doesn't pretend as to what he is. All right, some other questions, less related. What are your favorite online news sources? I love the Wall Street Journal and some of the New York Times, even though their opinion and econ pages are leftist rags. I mean, I don't love any news source. I read a lot of different ones. I definitely read the Wall Street Journal, and I like the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. It's got the best editorials, I think, in the country. I read the New York Times because I think you have to. The New York Times is one of the, it's a newspaper that has journalists, and they go out there, and you can't discover anything about the world if you don't read where that knowledge is coming from. Now, it's biased. I know it's biased, and I adjust for that. And of course, there are stories they don't report on. So you can't just read the New York Times. You have to read widely. I do the same thing with the Washington Post with the same caveats. I also read The Atlantic, which I think is really often very interesting, again, even though mostly biased and wrong. I read Commentary Magazine, which is a kind of a neocon, because I find them interesting. And then I read a bunch of different blogs, but I'll read anything. So I also constantly looking at Google News, which reports from a bunch of different news sources. I look at, Apple News. Apple News and Google News, mostly Google News, though. I also look at some of the kind of the right-wing stuff just to see what's going on there. Sometimes they'll report on stuff that isn't being reported in kind of the leftist media. I'm suspicious of them even more than I'm suspicious of the New York Times. I think they're even more biased and even more distorted. But I will look at them. I will, so I'll scan Breitbart once in a while. I'll scan, what do you call it? I can't even remember everybody's name. But I'll just look across a variety of different sources, news sources. I don't rely on one. So if the story is important, then I will investigate more deeply. I'll check on other sources. As I said in the past, if they're quoting somebody, let's say they're quoting Trump, then I'll go look for Trump's tweet or Trump's talk. I won't rely on them retaining context, because I know they don't. I generally hate the National Review because of what they did to Ayn Rand, so I don't go there often. But there are some writers on the National Review, some of them have left, that I follow, like, what's his name? I can't remember names, so you'll have to forgive me. I like Jeff Jacoby. I mean, a lot of commentators I like. Drudge is what I was looking at. I scan Drudge. I scan these things, but again, they're all biased, so you have to look at everything. And it's difficult. It's difficult. And you have to keep in your mind that everybody out there today, there's no honest journalism. They're all biased. And they're all covering the things they want to cover, and they're not covering a lot of stuff that should be covered. And you're going to have to do the work yourself if you want to know that stuff. And you have to double-check things. All right, here's a creativity question. Do you think that creativity can be properly developed and used in an effective way when one is young? I do. I don't know that I know how. I'm not an educator, but I do think that it can be fostered in young people. It can be encouraged. I do think that the educational system as it exists today clearly discourages that and is very anti-creativity. Chris says that the journalist I was thinking of, or the commentator was thinking of, it was Johann Goldberg, and it is. I like Goldberg. I don't always like him. I don't agree with him certainly on it, but he's a good thinker. So I do think you can do that, and I think a proper educational system would do that. I think Montessori does that and encourages exploration, curiosity, and I think almost every 2-year-old is curious. It's why it's called the terrible twos. They ask why. They get into stuff they shouldn't be getting into. You tell them no, and they do it in spite of that. Why do they do it in spite of that? Because they're curious to see what happens. They're curious to see how you will respond, but also they're curious to say, why aren't you letting me do that? What will happen if I do it? So I think every young kid has the potential to be a creative person. We destroy it. We put them down. It's the terrible twos. Not the inquisitive twos, not the curious twos, the terrible twos. So I absolutely think that good parenting, you can't look, and it's not about just parenting and education. It's also about choices the child makes. And a child can make horrible choices, even if they have the best parenting and the best education. You can't control how your children what they'll grow up to be. You cannot control how they turn out. You can influence it, and you can certainly screw them up. That's easy. But on the positive side, so much of it is dependent on the choices they make. That's free will. That's what free will is about. Here's a question. How to introduce people into small talk to Ayn Rand and her concepts, philosophy, morality, etc., which don't know anything about her. Wow. I mean, I think that the primary way to do it is through ethics. It's through, the idea of a heroic life, the idea of a good life. You're gonna have to cover more than that, but that's a good way to get into it. But there are a million ways to do it. So you can introduce people in millions of ways to Ayn Rand, depending on the thing that interests you and depending on what you're good at. Whatever you're good at, whatever interests you, find an angle. If you're at a startup, technology, then you can talk about her view about entrepreneurs and the value of business and the value of great thinkers and the value of technology and human progress. If you're in, you got to do it. Or if you're an artist, the way to introduce people is through the Romantic Manifesto and talking a little bit about art and what it is and what makes great art. So whatever area you're in, whatever thing you know, bring in Ayn Rand's ideas into that. Don't do a talk from the perspective, I don't know anything, I want to introduce people to Ayn Rand. Start with what you know, with what you're an expert in, and then figure out, what does Ayn Rand say about the thing that I'm an expert in that is going to make them curious about Ayn Rand? And you don't have to present the whole philosophy. Don't try. Do not try. Focus on a few points. Never do more than 3 points in a talk. All right. Well, it's an hour and a half already. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you get something out of these. If you do, I hope you show that support and show that value proposition that you get from these by supporting the show at yaronbrookshow.com/support. You can also do it on subscribestar.com/yaronbrookshow. yaronbrookshow.com/support is the best place. Have a great rest of Sunday. Not much left of it. And have a great week. Next shows, not sure exactly. I'm leaving for London tomorrow. I'll probably be doing a couple of shows from London, but that depends, of course, on quality of internet and timing. So the next 2 weeks I'm traveling. I'll be releasing different videos, but in terms of live shows, I'm hoping to do 2 or 3 or 4, but it's gonna be hard. So until I get back in this country, see you guys. Have a great week. Have a great